Well, hello everyone. It is now the top of the hour. It is time to start talking about our ramble and going on that. Welcome to I think it's our 7th or 8th ramble in the series, and I'm Jeff Richards. If you haven't visited and joined us before, I'm one of the trustees of the Friends of St. Nicholas Churchyard, and you've joined me as we're holding these virtual rambles because, of course, we can't actually go into the churchyard and do these rambles ourselves. It is still the time when we have to make sure that we are staying at home, we are protecting the NHS, and we are therefore saving lives. But nevertheless, we are in a historic time, and being a historic time, we can make time for history and start thinking about what it means to us still living in Sutton, and what it is we have as a heritage. Now, I am enormously grateful that we've got the support and encouragement for a number of different organisations for these talks. We are building quite a library of little bits of historical snippets and looking at things that we've not really looked at before. So first of all, we've got the support of Enjoy Sutton. Enjoy Sutton is an organisation of around 500 community groups and businesses, all largely operating within the High Street area. That's the business improvement district, wanting to make the best out of Sutton. And we also have the support of Sutton Civic Society, which is the civic society for Sutton, the main part of the heart of the borough. And it's a critical friend of the council, hoping to make sure that development within the borough plan is actually improving the lives of residents. Now, I am also very pleased to say that we are encouraged and are encouraging in turn people to explore local history through the classes run by Sutton College. Sutton College run a whole host of different history and cultural classes within their curriculum, so I would check that out. And the reason we're talking and suggesting that you look to them is that I touch on a number of different things in these rambles, and if you want to learn more about topics such as women's rights or the idea of the Glorious Revolution, both topics which are fairly major within today's theme, then please do check out their courses. Now, in my previous talks, I introduced you to the Mason family. I introduced you to Sir Richard and to Lady Anne Margaretta, or Anna Margaretta Long. Together, they formed the basis of the parents of the Mason family. And so Richard bought Sutton from Thomas Weston, who was the Earl of Portland in 1669. And so he then became Lord of the Manor of Sutton. And their two daughters who had been born in Shropshire, Dorothy Mason. Dorothy was born in 1664, and Anne was born in 1665, and so she was a year younger than her big sister Dorothy. And it was when Anne was 4 that the family moved to Sutton, and this is the little church that was, this is actually some 4 or 5 generations on from when Dorothy was here, but it represents more or less the time. It's the church she would have known, and we're going to find that of the two sisters, we spoke about Dorothy's wonderful character last week, but this time we're going to find that Anne had actually something of a very scandalous life, but it wasn't actually. It started off like she was going to have a fantastic life. So at the age of 15, Now, this is something you go, alarm bells start ringing. She got married when she was 15 on the 18th of June, 1683. And she got married in this church, which is actually St. Lawrence Jewry up in the city. And she married Charles Gerard, who was then called Viscount Brandon, and he was a man 9 years older than her. And she married also to get married before Dorothy. So that was quite unusual that that Sir Richard and Lady Anne Margaret had actually seen their daughter, youngest daughter, get married first. Now, who she married was Charles Brandon. He had been born in France in 1659, and so that was the year before the Restoration. So technically he was French by birth, and this is his father. This is another Charles Brandon. Charles Gerard, and Charles Gerard would become, because of his service to the crown, the first Earl of Macclesfield, and he had been a royalist soldier, and he came originally from the gentry class, and he had gone into exile with Charles II. Samuel Pepys actually gave an insight into these Gerard men by describing the older Gerard as proud and violent man whose rogueries and cheats were notorious. And his son also had a terrible reputation. And so if we think about, I don't know if Anne knew this, but and knew what she was getting into, because in May 1676, in a drunken temper, this man's son, her husband to be, when he was only 17, killed one of his servants in a drunken rage. He laid about one of his servants in St. James Park and killed him. And he actually absconded. He realized what he had done. He had killed a man, and so he scarpered off, but he was then granted a pardon. But both father and son were extremely anti-Catholic. They were... they had been actually 3 years before their marriage, before Anne's marriage, Charles had been a member of the what's called the Middlesex Grand Jury that had tried to present James, that was the Duke of York, who would become James the King, James III, as a recusant. And in the summer of 1682, he entertained the Duke of Monmouth during his progress through Cheshire. And so Monmouth was the bastard son of Charles I, and was seen as a possible alternative to James, because James at this point was without any male heirs. And the marriage, to fair say, is between Anne and Charles was a disaster. And Charles came from a Whig family. Although they had been adherents to Charles, they rapidly, because of anti-Catholicism and the very high church that the monarch represented, were Whiggish, were very, very primitively Whiggish in their attitude. They had a reputation for recklessness, but where Anne came from a family that was actually pretty staunchly Tory, although their appointment of William Stevens and as a rector at the time of the Glorious Revolution in 1688 indicated that they could wobble. But anyway, Charles Gerard, he got caught up in the fringes of what was called the Rye House Plot in 1683. And the Rye House Plot was really a bonkers plan to assassinate King Charles and his brother James, who was the heir to the throne. And this is like trying to do the nuclear option. They were on the fringes. They weren't. They were probably talking big and talking stupid, because they were sent to the Tower. Father and son were both sent to the Tower, and following the collapse of the plot. But actually, they were put on trial and eventually acquitted in the November. So the Rye House plot all fell through in the July. And they'd been ended up in prison and released in the November of 1683. Now, in the meantime, considering how much time he just had 6 months in prison, when he got released, Charles Gerard managed not to have any sort of reconciliation with his wife. They'd only been married a few years. 2.5 years of togetherness, and it was already a failure. They were rowing, and it was constant quarrels. Brandon took Anne to his father's house. Now, this is the house that the Earl of Macclesfield, that Brandon, Charles Gerard, Viscount Brandon had went to his father's house. This is the house that they had built. This is in Soho, in Gerrard Street. It's not there now, this particular building, but this is an engraving of what the house looked like in the mid-Victorian period, early 19th century. And Anne just couldn't get on with either of the Charles Gerards at all. She couldn't get on with them at all. And in 2 weeks later, Charles's father threw Anne out of the house, just cast her out. So that's probably at the point in which Anne then went home to her mum, back home to Sutton. And this is Anne. So you have to understand, this is what Anne looked like. Absolutely beautiful young woman. In 1685, in March, Charles Gerard wrote a long letter to his wife, in which he ordered her not to return. So he's basically dismissing his wife. He defended vigorously his own conduct. So there's massive stories being told. And this is what Charles Brandon, or Charles Gerard Viscount Brandon, said. Your youth and folly did long plead your excuse, but when I saw ill nature in you, and ill will, not to say malice, in your mother join against me, I then had reason to despair of your amendment. I sought not to make a prey of you, as you have often upbraided me withal, and that I had no such mercenary thoughts you would have had the world believe that I have used you ill, and that I have beaten you, a thing so base that as you know it to be false yourself, so you will never be able to persuade the world that it is true. I have governed my passions under great and fervent provocation, either by silence or by avoiding your company. His indulgence, I think personally he's protesting too much. We already know that he's a killer. He had killed and beaten a servant, and it's likely that he had been, well, we'll see later on. But his indulgence certainly had reached its limit, because he's certainly laying out how the relationship had reached the end point. You have often times spoken with scorn and contempt of me and my family to my face, and expressed that you did not care to have any children by me, but always pretended yourself with child whenever I went out of town from you. And now, madam, I am resolved to give you the satisfaction you have often asked in parting with me, which you may have cause to repent at your leisure. That's the crisis coming to a head. And just 6 days later, after Anne received that letter, Anne's father, Richard, died. And the parish records show that he was buried on the 18th of March in 1885 in Sutton. And both she, Anne, and Dorothy were named as co-heirs to Richard. Now, what happened next was quite interesting, because politics intervenes. The Duke of Monmouth, the Protestant illegitimate son of Charles II, landed in Lyme Regis in Dorset on the 11th of June, 1685. He landed with a force, but the rebellion ended in failure with the defeat of Monmouth's forces at the Battle of Sedgemoor on the 6th of July in 1685. Now, following the rebellion, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Gerard and his father, and they were both committed to the Tower on the 31st of July in 1685. He was tried with treason and was sentenced to death on the 28th of November. Ironically, Anne pleaded for him with King James. Charles Gerard was reprieved, first of all in January in 1687, and then pardoned on the 31st of January 1687. He then flip-flopped, because he had been sentenced to death. He then flip-flopped and actually became then a partisan for James II. So he supported James II's policies and was therefore granted his father's estates as a result. This all left us in a position where Anne was now completely deserted by her husband, and she was unhappy. And it reaches a point because at this point, she'd never been as beautiful as her sister. This is another engraving of Anne. And what good looks she apparently did have were marred by then her catching smallpox. By this time, it's worth remembering, she's only 18. She's only 18. Now, in 1688, James II was overthrown in a coup d'etat by William of Orange and James's daughter, Mary. This was the Glorious Revolution. This picture is of William landing at Torbay, and it's obviously a marshal showing the troops landed. Anne's estranged husband, Charles Gerard, actually took the field and opposed William in 1688 because he had been restored the previous October to the position of Colonel of Lord Gerard's horse in 1679. After the revolution, after this, Anne tried to get hold of the lands involved in the settlement dispute. These are other properties elsewhere around the country, all tied up with the Mason settlement, her dowry. But Gerard, Charles, was something of a cunning fox. He managed to mend his bridges with William, and then he even managed to get returned into Parliament as one of the representatives for Lancashire. So he actually also became Lord Lieutenant of that county. So that tells you that's really with Macclesfield. That's where they're up. That's where their land is. Now Anne is intelligent. She's bright. She's witty. Even though she's not as good looking as she was because of the marks on her face. But this is somebody who became her friend and her lover. This is Henry, Duke of Grafton, and he's an illegitimate son of King Charles II. He became her lover. This is when Anne was about 25. Henry is about 27 here. He actually goes and gets himself killed during the Williamite Jacobite War in Ireland, and is killed after he's shot in the storming of Cork in Ireland. Now, as a by the way, to give you a sense of how attractive, how beautiful Anne was, then let's remind ourselves of what this woman, who this woman is. Now, I don't think I've ever shown you this woman. I've never mentioned this woman before. This is Isabella. This is this man's wife. So Henry, Henry Fitzroy, is married to Isabella, and and she was one of what are called the Hampton Court beauties. William III had portraits painted of the most beautiful women in his court, and she's one of these 8 Hampton Court beauties which are represented. But let's bear in mind, Henry thought that Anne was hotter than his wife and was more exciting, was probably brighter, was probably more fun to be with, and more exciting in every way. Her next lover was Richard Savage. In early 1693, Richard Savage was then Lord Colchester. He hadn't yet inherited the Rivers title. He became her lover, and Anne was 28 at this time. So at the death, and so that was 1693. So Anne is 28. In 1694, when Anne is 29, her father-in-law, the Earl of Macclesfield, dies, and so Charles Gerard, her estranged husband, inherits the title of the Earl of Macclesfield, and so suddenly Anne is now the Countess of Macclesfield. But Anne is carrying on with Richard Savage, Earl Rivers, and they had 2 children. So Anne and Richard. Anne was born in 1695, and Richard was born 2 years later. So you can see that they're named after each other. Now, Anne went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the birth. She actually wore a mask while giving birth. She disguised herself because the midwife would recognize there was a certain who is this mysterious person giving birth, and it was Anne. Well, the Earl of Macclesfield, Charles Gerard, learnt of these 2 children appearing in quick succession, and was not overly happy about having children appear carrying entitlement to his title. He started proceedings for divorce against Anne. Now, Anne was desperately frightened that what was happening would be the loss of all her inheritance and all the dowry that was tied up as the co-heir to her father Richard estate. So she resisted the action, and the Earl, because of that delay, because she was resisting this divorce, this church divorce, started proceedings in the House of Lords. And this is where history is made in Sutton, in the sense that this is an unprecedented action to actually proceed for a divorce in the House of Lords, as no marriage ever before had been dissolved by Parliament prior to a decree from an ecclesiastical court. But nevertheless, a bill of divorce was introduced on the 15th of January, 1698. So they got they got divorced, not through the courts, not through the church. So Anne had married Charles when she was 15 in 1683, and they had lived apart since 1685, and finally they got divorced in 1698. Now, that meant that her children by Richard Savage were now declared as illegitimate. The Earl was not responsible for her debts and or for the children, but because actually of his profligacy, the court considered that because of basically the way he was behaved, he was responsible for his wife's actions. The act ordered him to repay her marriage portion. This was actually a pretty good settlement for Anne. So this is the fourth divorce bill to be passed by both houses of Parliament and become a law without judgment from an ecclesiastical court. Anne got back her fortune, and she got back, surprisingly, a huge amount of her reputation as well. So the settlement that she got back was something like between £12,000 and £25,000. An enormous amount of money was returned to Anne on her divorce. And society, and by this I mean the court society, would normally have been expected to recoil in horror at such a scandal as this. But Anne was seen as very much the wronged woman, and she was reconciled with the court to such an extent that she became lady in waiting to the Princess Anne, who was the sister of Queen Mary and would herself become Queen Anne. And it was in fact Charles Gerard who was given the universal hiss because of his behaviour. He was a nasty sort of person all round. Now, Anne's affair with Richard Savage, Lord Rivers, would have come to an end before or at this time. Dean Swift, as in Jonathan Swift, the person who wrote Gulliver's Travels, would have known her. Because he certainly makes a dig in Anne's directions when he was an intimate of, he was a friend of Earl Rivers, but was rather peeved that when Earl Rivers died, he wasn't remembered in his will, and he was rather unkind in saying he made a fierce comment on the Earl's bequests to his mistresses and the neglect of his friends. Now, that's a first indication that Anne is moving in literary circles. And her son, interestingly, or alleged son, was Richard Savage, the poet. And I've got a picture of here. Now, Dr. Johnson certainly believed that Richard Savage was Anne's son. Anne never acknowledged this, and she never acknowledged the claim, and always maintained that both children had died in infancy. It gets very, very messy at this point because there's all sorts of strange behaviour taking place, because Richard Savage turning up drunk to Anne's house claiming he wants to see Mummy, and Anne being resolute and saying she doesn't have any living children. But quite a bit of society at the time believed that Richard Savage was Anne's son. And he was, more importantly, Anne's nephew, John, who is the son of Dorothy. He believed that Richard Savage was his natural nephew, and so supported him in the claim. Probably it's to do with the estate and where the money was going to go. But certainly Sir John Brownlow, Dorothy's son, supported Richard Savage in his claim. Now, this is Dorothy. Dorothy was Anne's elder sister, and universally acknowledged as even more beautiful than Anne. And she died, though, in 1699, aged 36, and she was buried in St. Nicholas in Sutton. And I spoke last week about the fantastic monument that's in St. Nicholas, and yet covered up as well. Now, within a year of Dorothy dying, William Brownlow, Dorothy's husband, actually remarries. He remarries a lady called Henrietta Brett. Henrietta Brett is the sister of Henry Brett. Henry Brett was an English man about town. He was an army officer, but he was also a Tory politician, something of a mover and shaker. Again, that emphasizing the fact that this was essentially a Tory family, very much linked into the court and reliable in that regards. So an army officer, Tory politician, mover and shaker, but highly interested in literary and dramatic events. So very much he was a friend of playwrights like Richard Steele and John Addison. And after the divorce that Anne went through, and again, this is Anne again, 2 years after her divorce in 1700, she married Henry Brett. So John Brownlow has married her sister-in-law, and you've got this twining of the families, and they're very much involved in artistic affairs. So after they got married, Henry Brett was a member of the Parliament for Bishop's Castle in Shropshire. Shropshire was where the Mason family had property. He also obtained in 1705 the lieutenant colonelcy of a regiment of foot, but he actually gave that up then. But all this time, Anne was developing literary tastes and developing a reputation, and they moved in the same circles as all these intelligentsia in the plays and things. And this is a guy called Colley Cibber, playwright, poet, novelist, and Colley Cibber had submitted his best play, and we know that he submitted his best play to Anne for her to check over and to get her advice on the play. So his best play, The Careless Husband, was reviewed by Anne, and that was in 1704. When Anne's mother eventually died in 1717. So you can see here is a record from the St. Nicholas registers. And so Lady Anna Margaretta died in July of 1717. She was buried at St. Nick's as well. So her grave is at St. Nicholas. But after the death of her mother, Anne and her nephew, John Brownlow, basically came to an agreement to settle up the estates and divide the property. And they sold it to Henry Cliff. They sold Sutton as a manor to Henry Cliff, who was the East India captain. So he'd made his fortune through trade. That ended the Mason link to Sutton. So we don't get anything directly in Sutton now after 1717. But it wasn't quite the end of the story for Anne, and I think it's worth following through until the end. So Anne's husband, Henry, died in 1724. And after her husband died, they had a daughter. Their daughter was called Anna Margaretta, after her grandmother. Sir Richard had married Lady Anna Margaretta Long. So Henry and Anne had a daughter. When they got married in the 1700s. So she's about 24 at this time, and she becomes the first known English mistress of George I, who's pictured here. So she's I don't have a portrait for her, but in writings, in descriptions, so, and she's described, their daughter is described as a Spanish-looking. She has something of the dark eyes, dark hair, very looking. Probably she was a stunner, because Anne was a stunner, and you've got. Anyway, she became the mistress of George I when he was 65. So she'd hoped perhaps to get some elevation from sharing the bed with this elderly king. Unfortunately, it wasn't to play out, because he died, and she subsequently then married Sir William Lehman in after 1727. The king had died in 1727. They basically had 3 years. She had 3 years as George I's mistress. Just a note: this portrait was painted by Sir Godfrey, or from the studio of Sir Godfrey Kneller. He was the court painter. He was the one who had painted the 8 Hampton Court Beauties. He had painted Anne. He had painted Dorothy. So this is all within high society. This is that you're talking creme de la creme, really, here. Now, Anne was to live on. She survived her husband by nearly 30 years. She survived her daughter by 10 years. Anne herself died on the 11th of October, 1753. And she died at where her home was in Old Bond Street in London. And she was 85 when she died. So although her life had been scandalous, it had been long. And she was able to at least look back and realize that all her detractors, all those who had caused her pain, had passed away before her. That brings us to the end of the tale. I have intended to inform, to educate, and hopefully entertain you. I have come to the end of this ramble, so I hope you have enjoyed all those different stories that I shared. If you want to know more, then please do go to Sutton College, where you'll learn more about local and national history. They've got lots and lots of different themes running inside their curriculum. Please do let me know how I can improve these talks, and next week, I'm going to be rambling on about the roads and the proximity to London and how that together shaped the growth of Sutton. I'll follow the story up to the coming of the railway. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye. So long, Sutton. Your history.